Founding Fathers, pre-chapter 8. Now, I know you've noticed that there are three particular sections for this chapter, and you're thinking, oh, Mrs. Graves has totally lost her mind. She's gone over the hill. No, in reality, I'm trying to make it easier for you because this chapter, chapter 8, is one of the longest ones in the text. It covers 25 years, and there is so much going on, and you're introduced to so many different events and so many different people, which is like almost high school. You're studying names and places and dates instead of learning the why it happened or the people that were involved. And I know I find it interesting as a historian, but as a student, you know, these people have been dead for hundreds of years. I mean, what interest could they have to you? So what I would like to do is put a little flesh on the bones of our founding fathers. And if I do this in the lecture itself, it's going to make the lecture so long, it's going to, well, in all honesty, I recorded a lecture the other night, and when I submitted it to YouTube, it crashed because it was so long. So I realized I got to cut it down. So I pulled out some of the YouTubes, and I'm going to separate the information on the Founding Fathers out of the chapter. This way you can watch it at 3 different times. You can, do what you want to, and it won't be so hard on you. So let's get to it, and I'm going to reintroduce you to some of our Founding Fathers. The first one being George Washington. Now, everybody knows George. I mean, wasn't he the one that chopped down the cherry tree and told his daddy he couldn't tell a lie, and he threw a dollar across the Potomac, and oh my goodness, he had wooden teeth. I mean, we know all kinds of stuff about him. But let's see what historians have to say about him.
George Washington was a Virginia gentleman and a great soldier who became the father of his country.
George Washington, the first United States president, was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on February 22, 1732. He came from a prominent family.
He had a very regal bearing. Washington's property holdings were extensive.
He was homeschooled until the age of 16, when he left home to help map the boundaries of the English colony of Virginia. Then in 1752, his brother and his niece both died, and the 20-year-old Washington inherited his family's fortune, including their home in Mount Vernon, Virginia.
George Washington was a slave owner. He had hundreds of slaves.
In 1753, when the French began seizing British territory in the American colonies, Washington, a major in the Virginia militia, was sent to defend the Crown's claims.
Washington fought against the French and the Indians in the 1750s when he was a British officer.
He led several military campaigns, and after the British won the war, he sought an officer's commission in the British Army.
He was turned down for a leadership position in the British military and was embittered by that.
In 1758, Washington left the militia and returned to Mount Vernon. Within 1 month, he married wealthy widow Martha Custis.
Martha, along with the property, made him one of the wealthiest leaders in Virginia and in the country.
Washington was elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses. He began to oppose the growing tax burden Britain was imposing on the colonies.
America felt that Britain, its mother country, was exploiting it for taxation and not giving it the freedom that it deserved to chart its own course.
George Washington was not a Patrick Henry or a Sam Adams or a Thomas Paine, any of the fervent extremists, if you will, who were leading the revolution. He was a more reluctant convert.
In March 1775, Washington was elected to the First Continental Congress. 1 month later, the Revolutionary War began.
Washington was literally the man on horseback who rode back to the Second Continental Congress, ready to take charge of the Patriot Army.
In March 1776, Washington's army won its first victory, beating the British in Boston. The British evacuated Boston, and Washington moved his army to New York City. But within months, Washington was forced to flee New York City.
George Washington lost battle after battle, but he never lost the war. He always lived to fight again another day.
On Christmas night, 1776, Washington attacked the British.
George Washington was a guerrilla leader. When he crossed over the Delaware River, he was using guerrilla tactics, stealth, to do it, and no one was expecting it to happen.
Washington defeated the British in Princeton and Trenton, but following those victories was a long, harsh winter for the Continental Army.
Valley Forge was the low point. That cold, bleak winter, they were walking barefoot in the snow. Washington's strategy was all about making it for another day.
Washington won the last major conflict of the Revolutionary War in October 1781, with the surrender of the British fleet at Yorktown. In 1783, with the war over, Washington resigned and went home to Mount Vernon.
Washington is pulled back into the political fray, back into Philadelphia in that hot summer of 1787, where they carve out the new Constitution. And he agreed to become president to help unify this new nation.
On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States.
Washington was the only man unanimously elected on the Electoral College.
Washington led the young nation from the Capitol in New York City, serving 2 terms as president.
Washington understood that for the democracy to be really a real democracy and for there to be popular rule and not rule by kings, he had to give up power. He had to set the example of the chief executive who voluntarily gives up power and goes home.
On December 14, 1799, George Washington died.
When he died, he freed his slaves. He emancipated them upon his death. So Washington was, even in death, the unifying man.
Okay. I told you he married a wealthy widow named Martha Curtis. He did, and from everything I have discovered about the man, he did love her, but he was not in love with her. His real true love was a married lady on an adjoining plantation called Sally Fairfax. We have copies of their letters in historical archives that he even got upset one time because there was rumors floating around about there maybe being some hanky-panky between them. And he stated that there was nobody's business in the world what went on between the two of them, even though he was married to Martha at the time. Do I believe that he ever consummated this long-distance love? From everything I have learned about Washington, he was a true Virginia gentleman, and I think that he loved from afar. Was he in love with Sally? Yes, he was in love with Sally, but he loved his wife, and he was not going to do anything to sully his reputation as a Virginia gentleman and, of course, the President of the United States. Also, I'd like to point out the fact that on one of those slides you saw of him, he's had a Masonic apron on. Yes, good old George was a member of the Masons. Now, our next founding father is John Adams, who's not one of my favorite founding fathers. He was I'm trying to think of a nice way to put it. He was a little bit sanctimonious. He was also terrifically felt inferior to people. Let's see what the historians have to say about Mr. Adams.
Everyone supports an open internet. Some support net neutrality regulation because they think
Love commercials.
John Adams was the first vice president and the second president of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. He was born on October 30th, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts. John Adams was the great-great-grandson of John and Priscilla Alden, pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. His father was a farmer and cordwainer, a maker of leather goods, who also served as a church deacon. John had 2 brothers, Peter and Elihu. Elihu died during the American Revolution. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. The career of John Adams included the roles of a lawyer, diplomat, politician, and statesman. He advanced to the position of vice president, serving under George Washington from 1789 to 1797. He became the second president of America in 1797 and served for 4 years until 1801. John Adams married Abigail Smith on October 25, 1764. They had 5 children whose names were Abigail Amelia, John Quincy, Susanna, Charles, and Thomas Boylston. The Adams were the first residents to live in the Executive Mansion, later called the White House. The first child to live in the White House was their 4-year-old granddaughter, Susanna. His son, John Quincy Adams, was destined to become the 6th President of the United States. John Adams belonged to the Federalist political party. He was 61 years old when he was inaugurated as the second president. Thomas Jefferson stood as the vice president. In 1800, the White House became the official home of American presidents. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both signed the Declaration of Independence prior to being elected as presidents of America. John Adams had a slight figure, standing at 5 feet 7 inches. His color was unusually high. His face was often red from exertion, and his blue eyes blazed. He was well-knit, muscular, and quick and sure in his movements. During his lifetime, he played a key role in major events of the era, notably the XYZ affair and the naval quasi-war with France. John Adams was instrumental in exposing the XYZ affair, providing Congress with letters from the Peace Commission indicating French efforts to bribe and intimidate U.S. officials. During his life, John Adams suffered from respiratory infections and depression. When he was young, he was inoculated against smallpox and spent 3 weeks in the hospital, suffering headaches, backaches, knee aches, gagging fever, and an eruption of pockmarks. As he aged, most of his teeth fell out, but he refused to wear dentures and therefore talked with a lisp. He was 90 years old when he died of heart failure and pneumonia on July 4, 1826, in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was buried in the family crypt beneath the United First Parish Church. Coincidentally, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within a few hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826. So ends our short biography about the life and presidency of John Adams. He was the first vice president and the second president of America. He is highly regarded as one of the most influential founding fathers of the United States. The next U.S. president was Thomas Jefferson. This video is one of a series. It's covering all of the American presidents and his cover.
So you see John Adams. Things that's not there, of course, when he was born, his father had plans on him becoming a minister. John wanted to be a farmer like his father. But he sent him away to school, and while he was gone, the biggest problem they had was keeping him in class. He kept wandering out in the woods. So his dad brought him home and proceeded to teach him how hard farming was going to be, and becoming a minister would be a step up in the society. Well, he worked him from before daylight till after dark, and John decided right quick after a few weeks of this that farming was not what he wanted to be, so he went away to school again. He finished his schooling and entered Harvard at the age of 15. He graduated from Harvard and went to teaching, and fortunately for us, his schoolhouse was located just across the street from a courthouse. And when he wasn't teaching, he'd go over and he'd listen to the lawyers talk. He became very attached to the law. He decided he was going to study law, and he left teaching and became a lawyer. It was after he became a lawyer that he actually met Abigail. Now, like I said, there's got to be more to John Adams than what we see on paper and read about. He's a little bit sanctimonious, but Abigail loved him, so there had to be something there that I'm just not seeing. Another founding father is Alexander Hamilton. Of course, we already know that he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. We'll learn more about him in the chapter. Let's see what history says about him. He's one of the few people I can call a bastard and get away with it, because he really was.
Alexander Hamilton was a lawyer, soldier, statesman, and the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Alexander Hamilton was one of the strongest proponents that we had among the founding fathers for what's called a federalist form of government, which involves a very strong centralized government.
Alexander Hamilton was born between 1755 and 1757 in the British West Indies. The product of an adulterous affair, he was abandoned by his father in 1766 and grew up without privilege.
He came to the mainland colonies in 1773 and soon enrolled in what was then King's College, what is now Columbia University.
New York at the time was a hotbed of continued political faction. We soon found out that what was much more interesting was to become involved in this strife. And he published his first piece of writing very soon afterwards, which he signed as a friend of America.
When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Hamilton left college to join in the fight, and by 1777 he was a lieutenant colonel and aide-de-camp to General George Washington. While still in the Army, Hamilton married Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of the rich and powerful General Philip Schuyler.
After the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton worked as a lawyer in New York.
Hamilton joined the Continental Congress and in 1787 was a New York delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. There he fought to replace the flawed Articles of Confederation with a constitution that guaranteed a strong central government.
He was actually the architect and author of the majority of what became known as the Federalist Papers, 85 different articles published in newspapers that were designed to convince the states to ratify the U.S. Constitution.
When George Washington was elected America's first president in 1789, he tapped Alexander Hamilton to be the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Alexander Hamilton designed the Treasury Department. He believed that it was the role of the federal government to collect and disperse money. At the same time, he was fervent about paying down the national debt.
Hamilton laid out a plan for how a national economy could actually emerge at a time when many people didn't know how it possibly would.
In 1795, Hamilton stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury, leaving behind a more secure U.S. economy. Hamilton returned to his law practice, but remained involved in politics. His support of Thomas Jefferson in the heated 1800 presidential election secured Jefferson's victory over Aaron Burr. For Burr, this marked the first of many perceived slights by Hamilton.
On July 11, 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr met on the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey, which was really the end of a long-standing political feud and personal feud between these two men.
Hamilton didn't shoot at him, basically said, "This is ridiculous, I'm just going to shoot in the air." And then Burr levels his gun and shoots at him. It makes Burr seem like a lesser man.
Alexander Hamilton died the next day in New York City on July 12, 1804. Today, he is remembered for establishing the federal principles of national government and is the face of the $10 bill.
I want to clarify just a little bit. We all know that anyone who writes anything, whether it's an essay, excuse me, my dog's upset, whether it's an essay for school or whether it's a historical novel or whatever, you have an agenda. You're trying to present what you believe to the public and perhaps change their minds. Now, I have done extensive research on this problem between Burr and Hamilton, focusing on Burr primarily, but this perceived slight of Burr by Hamilton is the exact opposite. Hamilton was a product of a time when the sins of the father were vested upon the children. Nowadays, it doesn't matter what your parents did, you're not going to be blamed for it one way or the other. And it was not Alexander Hamilton's fault that he was born a bastard. It was just a product of an illicit relationship, so to speak. But he fought it continuously. He was always looked down upon. He was never accepted in polite society. And he was a brilliant man. He had a mind like a steel trap. And when he was fortunate enough to meet up with Washington and become his aide during the Revolution and then working with him in the government, he was kind of under the umbrella of Washington's protection, so he was accepted. He married into society, a general's daughter, into politics in New York. He was a lawyer, and things looked pretty good for him, but things started going downhill after he resigned. He was having an open affair with a married woman in Philadelphia in 1803 and 4. His role in politics had diminished considerably because Washington was gone. His umbrella was gone. His father-in-law was not happy with him. His business wasn't going well. And then here was Aaron Burr, who was everything he had wanted to be, the son of a minister, a successful politician, a successful lawyer who had married very wealthy widow. You notice how many of them they marry wealthy widows? Married a wealthy widow, and she had children, but they only had one child, which is named Alexandra, which, incidentally, Alexandra is going to grow up and marry the governor of South Carolina. I digress, I'm sorry. So Burr was everything Hamilton wanted to be, and it just wasn't working out. Hamilton was writing a series of articles and putting them in the paper, lambasting Burr for his politics. And Burr took it. He didn't do anything about it until he started lambasting his family. Yes, Burr did challenge Alexander Hamilton to a duel, and there was a duel. That is a historical fact that cannot change. But the way it's looked at depends upon the way you read. And like the lady just said here, that Burr said this is silly and fired into the air. We don't know what Burr said. We do know that the first shot missed Burr, and Hamilton had the first shot because he was the one that was challenged, and it was his pistols. Now, Burr and Hamilton had both been in duels before. They had both won their duels. They were both good shots. Everyone had tried to get him to stop. I mean, after all, Aaron Burr was at the time the sitting vice president. And Alexander Hamilton, although not people's favorite at the time, he was, the first secretary of the treasury and a friend of Washington. And my philosophy is that death, accident, or suicide, it could go either way. Like I say, Hamilton's finances were in the dumpster. He was having an open affair. He was not high politically right now. And Burr was all of these things. The first shot taken by Hamilton missed. Accidentally or on purpose, we don't know, but we know that it flew over Burr's head and embedded itself into a tree behind Burr. So technically, he didn't fire into the air. Now, according to the laws of duello, Burr had to take a shot. So you say, why did he shoot to kill? He didn't shoot to kill. He shot to wound. He shot and hit Alexander Hamilton in the leg. That's not a killing shot. Well, unless the bullet hits a bone and travels up to the stomach, which is what happened. The bullet entered the lower part of the leg, traveled up the bone into his stomach, and of course a stomach wound was fatal. So, was it it was an accident when Burr killed him, but was Hamilton trying to get Burr to kill him? Like, you talk about this death by cop suicide, where you go after a police officer with an unloaded gun. Did Hamilton want Burr to kill him, to destroy Burr, and to end his life? Or was it all just bad planning? We don't know, and we'll never know for sure. Our next founding father, Thomas Jefferson. Oh, we know lots about him. But let's see what the historians have to say.
This is where my mom
Another advertisement.
This is where my mom got her degree. My aunt did it here.
Thomas Jefferson might be the most important person of the American Revolution. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the first diplomat abroad. He is the first Secretary of State, the second Vice President, and the third U.S. President.
Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, on his father's prosperous Virginia plantation.
He had an outstanding education. He started at the College of William and Mary in the state of Virginia, and then later studied law under George Wyeth.
Jefferson practiced law in Virginia from 1767 to 1775. During this time, he met and married Martha Skelton, a 23-year-old widow. The couple had 6 children.
He also had a 3.5 decades long relationship with his wife's half-sister, Sally Hemings, who was also his slave. He had several children with her, and the only slaves Jefferson freed upon his death were the children he had with Sally Hemings.
In 1774, he drafted an extraordinarily important document, the Summary Rights of British America, that justified the right of Americans to be self-governing.
As a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, Jefferson was selected to write the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which he finished in June 1776.
John Adams chose Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence because he was such a fan of Jefferson's literary style. And Jefferson, who was only 33 years old at the time, managed to write it in 17 days.
The United States was the first country to declare its independence from a colonizing power in the modern age. And this document became a model for declarations of independence all over the world for 2 centuries.
During the Revolutionary War, Jefferson returned to Virginia, where he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and served 2 terms as governor.
While serving in the state legislature, Jefferson wrote the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. This became the basis for the drafting of the First Amendment.
Thomas Jefferson then succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France before becoming President George Washington's Secretary of State in 1789.
Thomas Jefferson had a bit of a bumpy ride as Secretary of State and ultimately resigned in 1793 because he had major political and ideological conflicts with the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton.
In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected third President of the United States after the House of Representatives broke an electoral tie with Aaron Burr.
The election of 1800 was such a contested election that could have ended in civil war, but it did not. It was resolved through democratic means, and the American experiment survived.
This was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing parties in Western history.
During his presidency, he cut the nation's debt in half, protected U.S. interests abroad by sending the U.S. Navy to deal with the Barbary pirates, and doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803.
They commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to go and explore that territory. And the expedition of Lewis and Clark remains one of the great exploring sagas of all of American history.
After Jefferson's second term, after he left office, he became very involved in founding the University of Virginia, the first secular university in the United States. He designed the campus, and he became its first rector or provost.
Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and the same day John Adams died.
Jefferson wanted to be remembered for three things. He ordered them carved on his tombstone: author of the Declaration of Independence and of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia.
Sounds like an absolutely great man, doesn't it? But Thomas Jefferson suffered from severe migraines. He did not like confrontation, and he would go out of his way to avoid it. He and John Adams were not the best of friends because different political parties and different ideological ideas. But he did rekindle his friendship with John Adams primarily because of Abigail. Abigail and Jefferson, they corresponded till the day they died. And the irony is, it's the only woman he ever treated as an intellectual equal. He thought women were on the same level as slaves. They were good for cooking and bedroom activities, and that was just about it. Not my favorite person. And of course, we'll learn a little bit more about him and his term in office in the actual chapter. John Jay, that's probably somebody you've never heard of. Unless you're into history, he was very prominent during the Revolution and afterwards, but you don't hear that much about him. And let's get a quick look at what historians have to say.
The Jay Heritage Center and the John Jay Homestead are both places where one can learn about the character and stature of one of America's founding fathers, a man who devoted his life to public service and was widely recognized for his efforts to abolish slavery. John Jay holds the distinction of having served in every American branch of government and many high offices, including the Governor of New York and the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Today, his boyhood home in Rye and his retirement home in Bedford are each recognized as National Historic Landmarks.
John Jay was a man of contradiction. While he recognized the incongruence of slavery in a free and democratic society, Jay was like many others of his time, in that he and his family owned slaves themselves. Both enslaved and free Africans worked and lived on the Jay properties in the 18th and 19th centuries. While Jay's father, Peter Jay, was one of the largest slave owners in New York State, his sons were leading advocates of emancipation, also known as manumission. Immediately after the independence in 1777, while helping to draft New York State's first constitution, John Jay sought to pass emancipation legislation, but it was overruled.
Faced with the flourishing slave market, Jay and a few dozen close friends mostly slave owners, founded the New York State Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves. The society entered lawsuits on behalf of slaves and organized boycotts against New York merchants and newspaper owners involved in the slave trade. A special committee visited newspaper offices to warn publishers against accepting ads for the purchase or sale of slaves.
John Jay was an advocate for black education, and in 1787, he helped the Manumission Society found New York's African Free School for poor and orphan children of slaves and free men. By the time the Manumission Society turned over the school to New York City in 1834, more than 1,000 children had been educated. Throughout its 71-year history, the society relentlessly battled against the slave trade and pushed for emancipation.
John Jay helped lobby for a state law that would abolish slavery in New York, as many other northern states had done. As governor in 1799, Jay signed a law that led to the emancipation of slaves in New York, and the last were freed before his death in 1829.
I know that didn't tell you that much about his personal life, but John Jay is mostly remembered in history books for his work with treaties, such as the Treaty of Paris and in the Revolutionary War, and Jay's treaty getting his rights to trade on the Mississippi. He seemed like he was in every diplomatic mission, but he was always kind of in the background. But he had a hard life. He had a lot of personal problems, like I said here. When his parents died, he had to care for his blind brother and sister. He had a brother, Augustus, who suffered from mental disabilities that forced Jay to provide not only financial but emotional support. He had another brother, Frederick, who was in constant financial problems, and John had to keep bailing him out. And he had another brother named James, who I guess you'd say, according to the writing, was in direct competition with his brother, because he joined the Loyalist fraction of the New York State Senate at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Now, his brother James was also what we call a fence-sitter. He would change loyalties at the drop of a hat, and Jay never knew from one minute to the next whether his brother was going to be a loyalist or he was going to be a patriot. He was in constant emotional strain because of family problems, and I think that's probably part of the reason he stayed in the background. I did read a little treatise one time on his marriage, and his marriage was solid. He never stepped out of line, but he admitted that marriage and family life was just a little bit more than he'd ever bargained for. The last of our founding fathers I'm going to look at is James Madison. Now, Madison, Jay, and Jefferson, of course, we will get into a little bit more in our text, in our chapter, I should say. But let's see what the historians say about Madison.
The time to buy is now at Jones Buick GMC with model year-end discounts up to 8.
James Madison, one of the nation's key founding fathers, also served 2 terms as America's 4th president.
James Madison is often called the father of the Constitution.
James Madison was born on March 16, 1751, at Belle Grove Plantation in Virginia. He attended Princeton University. In 1780, James Madison became the youngest member of the Continental Congress and was instrumental in arranging the 1787 National Convention to write a constitution for the new nation.
James Madison came up with this idea, known as the Virginia Plan, the system for bicameral legislature, which gave representation on population in the House of Representatives and to the states in the Senate.
Madison introduced the idea of checks and balances, that no one part of the government or no one person should have all of the political power enshrined in them.
After After the convention, Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay began writing numerous articles, now called the Federalist Papers, to convince the states to ratify this new constitution.
The Federalist Papers were important because they established the principles that a strong national government was needed to move the country past the Articles of Confederation and toward a new system of government.
In 1789, as a member of the House of Representatives, James Madison wanted transparency in government, and to that end, he introduced the Bill of Rights.
During his time in Congress, Madison met and married his wife Dolly. In 1897, Madison left politics and retired to his home in Virginia, Montpelier. He returned to politics in 1801, when his longtime friend, Thomas Jefferson, asked him to be his Secretary of State.
While Secretary of State, James Madison's greatest challenge was to prevent the kidnapping of American sailors by the British, who were trying to impress them into service. Ultimately, James Madison decided the United States needed to halt trade with Britain, and that eventually became the embargo of 1809.
In 1808, Madison succeeded Thomas Jefferson as President of the United States, winning by a wide margin.
James Madison's wife, Dolly, was known as a party giver. She was 21 years younger than the president. It's no surprise to hear that the first ever official inaugural ball occurred in 1809, following Madison's inauguration.
He was the smallest man ever to occupy the executive mansion. I think he was 5'4" and never weighed 100 pounds. Dripping wet.
During Madison's second term in office, relations with Britain devolved into what is now known as the War of 1812.
By 1814, the British had actually come right into Washington and started burning down the city. James Madison fled the capital.
In 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the war. When Madison left office, 2 years later, the country was prospering.
James Madison is really the architect of our founding ideals.
James Madison died on June 28, 1836.
Because of James Madison, we have the system of checks and balances, we have modern judicial review, and we have the Bill of Rights. That's the legacy of James Madison.
Reminds me of an old song we used to have when I was younger, called 5'2", Eyes Are Blue. James Madison was a very small man, as he just pointed out, and it seemed strange that he would be fluent in Hebrew, but yet he was. And some of our historians argue that he did lean toward deism. There is nothing in any of his writings that indicate any leanings one way or the other, if you want to be honest about it. It was his wife. Nobody really liked him. He was brilliant when it came to writing, but he did not have a good personality. He was not outgoing. He was happier reading or writing a paper on something, and he was brilliant in that way. Like I say, we call him the father of the Constitution, the father of the Bill of Rights. The problem is going to get into, and then we'll get into it in the chapter, when he tries to lead the army during the War of 1812, and he really wasn't big enough to even get on a horse to do it. So this concludes my introduction to 6 of our nation's founding fathers. And I hope with the little bit that I told you, these are not supermen. They were just educated white male men in the right place at the right time. Each of them had memorable qualities, yes. Yet each one of them did have some secret personal problems, and Madison and Jefferson both never really felt they were equal to their wives' families. So think of these men as just men doing a job as we work our way through Chapter 8, Securing the Republic.